Can't Hurt Me is primarily a memoir, but it offers a dash of self-help. Unlike most autobiographies by former Navy SEALs, including motivational gurus like Jocko Willink and celebrity SEALs like Chris Kyle, Goggins provides very little description of military action or commentary about his time on active duty, even though he served in the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Even his military training receives relatively little consideration, forming just a few chapters of his tale. Instead, the majority of the text is dedicated to Goggins' life as a civilian and an athlete. While he's arguably best known as an athlete, the trappings of the book play up his military service. The original hardback cover pictures Goggins in full uniform, even though he's retired, and the book opens with the faux military order, complete with Goggins' signature. The self-help elements of the book are limited to a few asides and a challenge section at the end of every chapter. The challenges are perhaps a ploy to make Goggins' life experience, which is extraordinary and perhaps impossible to replicate, seem more relevant to the average reader, who is unlikely to run a 24-hour race or set a Guinness World Record for pull-ups. The challenges often involve journaling exercises, self-talk, and goal setting, and always end with suggested hashtags so readers can post about their experiences on social media. As is typical for memoirs, Goggins writes in the first person, using a conversational style. He uses a lot of profanity and military jargon, including the frequent refrain of "Roger that." Often the text reads like a transcript of his inner monologue during a training session or a sporting event. The most confusing thing about the story is its timeline, which isn't strictly chronological. This is likely related to his decision to omit almost any mention of his service in Afghanistan or the Middle East. Goggins contacted several people, particularly his colleagues in the military, for informal interviews as he wrote the book, and occasionally he quotes them. Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins is a memoir about the author's unlikely rise from a boyhood plagued by violence and poverty into the elite ranks of the U.S. Navy SEALs and high-endurance athletics. By mastering his fear and pushing his body past its perceived limits, Goggins has achieved more than he ever thought possible. Currently, he's the only person in military history to have trained in every branch's elite special operations, including the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. It all began in upstate New York, where Goggins lived with his parents in a deceptively perfect-looking white wooden home. Beneath the family's nice house and fancy cars, there was an ugly secret. Goggins' father, Trunnis, frequently beat his children and their mother. In 1981, when Goggins was in the first grade, he could barely stay awake in class because his father made him work so hard at Skateland, the family's roller rink. His mother, Jackie, was afraid to leave Trunnis because she had no money and few prospects. But eventually, the situation got bad enough that she packed up her children and fled to her parents' home in Brazil, Indiana. Even though he was only 8 years old, Goggins was already behind in school. And while his home life had improved in the sense that he wasn't working long hours or taking beatings anymore, he and his mother lived in poverty with little to no child support. Goggins cheated in all his classes just to get by. When he was in 4th grade, his mother began seeing an Indianapolis man named Wilmuth Irving, a general contractor. They planned to marry, but Wilmuth was murdered under mysterious circumstances in 1989. The incident was traumatic for mother and son, but they moved to Indianapolis as they had planned. Goggins quickly fell in with the wrong crowd, so after just a few years, his mother picked up stakes and moved her family back to her hometown. Now a sophomore in high school, Goggins found that all the years of cheating in school were catching up with him. It was becoming harder to fake it, and the emotional problems he had from experiencing so much trauma and stress early in life were catching up with him too. On top of that, as an African American, he suddenly became aware of the rampant racism in his mostly white town. When he lived there before, he had been too young to notice. One night, walking home from a party, Goggins was threatened with a gun. Someone at school wrote racist slurs in his notebook, and later, someone spray-painted a slur on the side of his car. In the back of his mind, Goggins had long nursed a secret dream to join the Air Force, but he hadn't realized that he needed an education to pursue that dream. After almost failing out of school, Goggins finally confronted himself. He knew it was up to him to course-correct if he was going to succeed in life. The challenges he faced were real, but he realized that the only person getting in the way of his success was him. Immediately, he turned things around by studying, working out, and holding himself accountable to self-imposed standards of excellence. Goggins enlisted in the Air Force at 19 and decided to train for pararescue, an elite unit that specialized in rescuing downed pilots in water. He performed well, He had to work hard because his body wasn't naturally buoyant in water, and he was a weak swimmer. He also struggled because he was the only African American in his group. When he received a surprise diagnosis of sickle cell trait from an Air Force medical team, Goggins opted to accept a discharge. He could have stayed, but used the convenient excuse to leave. 4 years passed, and Goggins was absolutely miserable. His weight had almost doubled, and he had a horrific job as an exterminator, working late at night to clear restaurants of pests. He spent very little time with his wife, Pam, who retreated to her parents' house. But one day he saw a commercial for the Navy SEALs, and everything changed. He was entranced by their difficult training. Somehow it seemed appealing. Moreover, it seemed like a way out of his unhappy life. Goggins called recruiters all over the country, looking for one who would accept him even though he was woefully out of shape. Finally, he found one who agreed to take him on, Petty Officer Stephen Scaglio. There was a catch though, which was that Goggins had to lose just over 100 pounds in less than 3 months to meet the weight limit. He put himself on a grueling workout and diet regimen. When he was accepted into SEAL training, he divorced his wife and set off to begin a new life. It took 3 tries for him to get through SEAL training. He came down with pneumonia during his first Hell Week, a particularly grueling portion of SEAL training, and he wasn't fully healed by the time he was placed back into training. During his second Hell Week, Goggins injured his knee. He made it through, but fractured his kneecap during a particularly difficult training exercise soon after that. Goggins went home to heal and half-heartedly reunited with his ex-wife Pam. He saw it as a temporary reconciliation, but she became pregnant. He took this as bad news, but they remarried for a short time anyway. Meanwhile, he was told he could do SEAL training a 3rd time, but that another injury would disqualify him for good. He had to go through Hell Week a 3rd time, and though he made it through, he had small fractures throughout his shins. This was particularly bad news, given that the next phase of training required a lot of running. Digging deep within himself, Goggins ran on his broken legs and made it through the rest of training. Between deployments, Goggins worked as a SEAL instructor. He also trained as an Army Ranger, wanting to experience the elite forces of another branch of the military. In training for the Army's Delta Force, he became a bona fide leader and passed a difficult field test with flying colors. But he hurt his ankle, and the injury prevented him from completing that training. He vowed to try again when time and his body permitted. During Goggins' down periods, he became interested in ultramarathons, which are 100-mile runs over a 24 to 36-hour period. He was more of a weightlifter than a runner, but he signed up anyway, hoping eventually to run a famous ultramarathon called Badwater to raise money for a military charity. He was cavalier about that first race, which was in San Diego, and failed to prepare himself for it. In fact, he had only heard of the race a few days before. He finished with the support of his second wife, Kate, whom he had married a few months before, but pushed himself into acute kidney failure. The Badwater race had a competitive application process that required experience in other ultra races, so Goggins decided to do a second one in Hawaii. This time he dealt with extremely difficult terrain and serious weather. He had trained, but failed to properly plan for his nutrition and hydration needs. His inexperience was something that people gossiped about throughout the race, but he finished it. Finally, Goggins was accepted into Badwater. For this, he prepared extensively, but his injuries from the other 2 ultra races got in his way. Still, he finished in 5th place. Over time, Goggins became involved with other types of sporting events, including triathlons. As he gained recognition in athletics, the Navy took notice. He was asked to join its recruitment division in 2007, specially tasked with enlisting more African Americans, who made up only 1% of Special Forces, despite being 13% of the general population. Goggins excelled in this job, touring the nation to speak at universities. As the end of the assignment approached in 2009, he made plans to return to the field. But something unexpected happened. Goggins needed heart surgery. He had been born with a hole in his heart, but it had gone undetected until he started feeling gravely ill when exercising. Incredibly, this congenital defect meant that Goggins had been living with only about half of the oxygenated blood his body required for peak performance. He had achieved his impressive accomplishments, all while working with this limited capacity. Goggins went into surgery almost at once, but the procedure went poorly, and the patch the doctor placed on his heart didn't take. He had to recover for more than a year before a second surgeon got a shot. His heart issues finally resolved, Goggins returned to Delta Force to take his field test a second time. But he became distracted and botched the ending. With full medical clearance, Goggins returned to his life as a SEAL. But he began experiencing performance issues and feeling sick in the fall of 2014. This time, doctors weren't sure what was wrong. Ultimately, Goggins diagnosed himself, deciding that his muscles had become so tight that they wouldn't let his blood circulate properly. He began healing himself with an intense stretching regimen that he still followed at the time of the book's publication in 2018. Goggins retired from the Navy in 2015, but his adventurous spirit will not rest. In 2018, he became a wildland firefighter, which is brutal and dangerous work. With a fully functioning heart muscle, Goggins will continue to work to accomplish the seemingly impossible. Character analysis. David Goggins. Like many Navy SEALs, Goggins is a man of extremes. For the first part of his life, he swung back and forth between disordered eating habits on either side of the spectrum, gorging himself on sugar and fast food, and, on one memorable occasion, losing more than 100 pounds in just 3 months. At no point in his narrative does he reach an equilibrium that seems particularly healthy. A goal-driven person, Goggins responds to challenges, competitions, and deadlines, but often his enthusiasm turns into mania or fixation. He prioritizes finishing a task above his own safety. Often, he is reckless with his health and his life. Goggins sees most of his faults in a positive light, attributing his actions to desirable characteristics such as mental and physical toughness, dedication, and drive. What seems unusual about his self-destructive tendencies is that he's able to channel them into constructive service to a higher cause. His record of military excellence speaks for itself, and he has dedicated much of his time and effort to supporting charities. Curiously, his service seems to be motivated entirely by his quest for self-improvement. He shows no patriotism, at least in his writing. In his personal life, Goggins is a loner. His 2 ex-wives barely rate a mention in this memoir, and his second wife, Kate, is described only in relation to her support of his ultra racing. His only friends outside the military were in childhood. Everyone in his life exists at the margins. At one point, Goggins mentions that his first wife was pregnant with his child, but he never gets around to mentioning whether or not that child was born. The subject simply drops. The most generous interpretation is that Goggins wants to afford these people privacy, but the evidence points to the possibility that he has no close relationships in his personal or professional life. This lack can be attributed to his inability to connect with other people. His difficulty with intimacy is a direct result of the violence, neglect, and instability that he experienced in childhood. As a kid, Goggins had to be self-involved in order to survive, and the lesson he learned at an early age is that other people are unreliable and can't be counted on for much. His reluctance to quit races or abandon training exercises in the face of grave medical distress can't be dismissed as irrational in this light. If he were to give up, he would be letting himself down, at which point there would be no one left to count on. While Goggins isn't quite humble, he isn't egotistical despite his many accomplishments. He's just as quick to list his disappointments as his successes. These are interesting admissions from a military recruiter who sees himself as a role model, born from the philosophy that he considers failure to be an essential part of growth. Relationships. Goggins and his father. Goggins hates his abusive father, who has nonetheless been hugely influential in his life. His discussion of the years they spent together is tinged with disgust that colors everything. Goggins' writing about his father's roller skating rink, for instance, abounds with descriptions of grime and germs, including overflowing toilets, bacteria, and the toxic deodorizer he was required to spray on customers' dirty skates. Though Goggins hasn't spoken to his father since grade school, there's a sense that they have remained in conversation for all this time. The very title of the book, Can't Hurt Me, seems to be an indirect taunt from Goggins directed to his father. In a broader sense, Goggins built his entire personality around the idea that he can make himself impervious to pain. In trying to persist through the pain inflicted by a sadistic superior during SEAL training, the demands of a 100-mile race, or a pull-up bar that flayed the skin on his hands, Goggins set out to prove something to his father as much as he needed to prove it to himself. Goggins and Wilmoth. Goggins' relationship with his mother's boyfriend, Wilmoth, was the opposite of the one he had with his father. Where Goggins' father made him work every night until midnight, his relationship with Wilmoth consisted mostly of recreational activities like playing basketball games. When Wilmoth was brutally murdered just before he was to become Goggins' stepfather, it was traumatic and another incident of violence in Goggins' life. The event signaled to Goggins at a young age that the world, for him at least, would never be safe. The one person who had offered hope in his life was gone for reasons he would never understand. This added to the anxiety and instability that Goggins already managed from living with abuse and poverty. Goggins and his mother. Goggins clearly has love and respect for his mother, and their bond seems to be the closest personal relationship that he has. But she lacks any sort of agency in his life as a parental figure. As a child, Goggins saw his mother as self-absorbed, focusing mostly on her own self-improvement. She seemed to take an interest in his welfare, at least at first, as evidenced by her willingness to shuffle him between schools and cities to get a good education. But over time, this interest waned. Whether this was due to her busy schedule as a single mother, frustration with Goggins' behavior, depression, or something else is unclear. As an adult, Goggins seems to find it comforting to have his mother near, inviting her to sporting events and on other trips to support him. Since he's divorced, estranged from his father, and spent most of his life estranged from his brother, his mother is the one constant in his life. Themes: pain. Having experienced physical abuse at the hands of his father when he was a child, Goggins elects to spend his adulthood inflicting pain upon himself. Can't Hurt Me is a work of extreme body horror, replete with detailed graphic descriptions and disturbing photographs of injuries that Goggins has endured in the military and in extreme sports. Descriptions of broken toenails, grotesque blisters, hypothermia, dehydration, and bone fractures abound. Goggins catalogs these wounds with unbridled pride and even a perverse sort of glee. Even more than his accomplishments, he prides himself on his extraordinary capacity to endure physical pain. One of his proudest moments, which Goggins returns to frequently throughout the book, is how he completed his SEAL training by running on broken legs when he had multiple stress fractures. Goggins seems to regard this feat as exemplar, an inspirational story, rather than an account of behavior that was deeply unwise. At the same time, it's true that letting those injuries heal would have disqualified Goggins from becoming a Navy SEAL, suggesting that his values aren't entirely self-imposed. Indeed, while Goggins' masochism has clear ties to his childhood experience, some of his obsession with pain echoes the broader values of Western culture, especially Western military culture, which ties masculinity and success with the stoic endurance of suffering. Goggins is repulsed by what he frequently refers to as the victim's mentality, a mindset he links to femininity and homosexuality through his use of misogynistic and homophobic slurs. In Goggins' view, suffering is a choice, and anyone who opts out is a failure. He takes a form of pathological pride in his own injuries, at one point equating the kidney failure he experiences after a grueling race to a trophy. He frequently refuses medical treatment for life and limb-threatening injuries. While Goggins seems aware that the way in which he seeks out pain is related to the abuse he experienced at the hands of his father, he seems totally oblivious to the fact that, in adulthood, he has recreated his father's exact nonsensical attitude towards injury, that men should never be under a doctor's care. As a child, Goggins resented when his father prevented him from seeing a doctor when he was sick or injured. But as an adult, Goggins seems to find that stance not just reasonable, but also commendable, often refusing treatment and knowingly exacerbating his own injuries. Self-reliance. Self-reliance is another value that Goggins takes to extremes. The first indication is the book's dedication, a feature that authors almost always use to thank other people in their lives for their love and support. Goggins takes the unusual step of dedicating Can't Hurt Me to himself, referencing the unrelenting voice in his head that will never allow him to stop. Plainly, he considers himself a self-made man, but there is a certain irony in his need for other people to recognize the accomplishment. This need for recognition is reflected in Goggins' drive to win races, set world records, and enter the elite ranks of the military. Other people's approval is extremely important to him, and he will go to extraordinary lengths to earn it. Like so many features of his mental life, Goggins' self-reliance stems from the physical abuse he was subjected to as a child. The worst beatings he received from his father made Goggins feel out of control, a form of psychological torture that was perhaps worse than the physical abuse. He would await the beatings in a darkened room, never knowing at which point his father would appear. When the lashes started, Goggins had no way of knowing when they would end. It's unsurprising then that Goggins was later drawn to the regimented nature of military life, where expectations and consequences were crystal clear. During his training, Goggins struggled with the inherent uncertainty in Hell Week. His fixation on finding the instructor's program so he would know what to expect during his second time through the program can be understood as a need for the control he never had when he was a child. Before he ever joined the military, Goggins had already transformed himself, dramatically reshaping his lifestyle, his brain, and his body. He didn't have much parental guidance as a minor, so he had to step in to become his own support system. He dramatized this role by talking to himself in the mirror, which he christened the accountability mirror. Having experienced such a profound lack of nurturing in his life, Goggins was thoroughly unequipped to support himself in a positive, cheerleading manner. Instead of giving himself a pep talk, he dressed himself down like a military sergeant, emphasizing his own flaws and fiercely demanding action. Racism. Goggins has dealt with overt and subtle strains of racism in all areas of his life. In his personal life, he endured explicit taunts, slurs, and threats on his life as a high school student in Indiana. As a military professional, signs of racism became less obvious, with Goggins experiencing racism as a systemic issue that prevented his professional advancement, rather than an overt weapon wielded by individuals. Even less directly, he has felt the insidious effects of racial inequality. Goggins frequently refers to his experience as being the only black person in the room, whether it's at his school, in his military cohort, or at athletic events. Individually and collectively, all these forms of racism took a toll. As a young person whose emotional development had been stunted by his abusive household, Goggins had few coping skills. He found it especially difficult to manage the discomfort and alienation he felt in his racist community. Even by the people around him who were inclined to help, like a sympathetic high school principal, racist acts were regarded as an immutable fact of life. This was exasperating to Goggins, who knew that racism was wrong, but he came to internalize their logic. He decided that the variable over which he had control was his own behavior, so instead of eliminating racism, he would address his own discomfort with it. Goggins effectively turned a bad situation into a positive feedback loop. His emotional discomfort became fuel for his grueling training sessions, and his grueling training sessions helped prepare him for the uncomfortable situations that would inevitably arise in his life. Overcoming physical pain, or at least knowing that he could endure it, helped him work through his emotional pain. Later, he also found more proactive ways to address the systemic problems he encountered, especially when he worked as a recruiter. As a role model for African American youths, he could honestly explain that, in the military, they wouldn't be the only black person in the room.